Carbon emissions. We will talk about this several points throughout this course, but carbon emissions or carbon dioxide emissions are caused by burning fossil fuels, and they are creating global warming. And we can look up data for carbon emission by countries. And I have listed the top 10 carbon polluting countries, and the emissions in tons of CO2, carbon dioxide, are listed here. We will also look at the population of each of these countries, which is relevant when looking at this to put things in perspective. But first, write China's carbon emissions as a number with words. So can you see that this is 10 billion? So 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide for China. And sometimes we say 10 gigatons. And we learned earlier in this course that giga is a prefix that means billion. So 10 gigatons of CO2 for China, and about 5 gigatons of CO2 for the United States. So we have about half of the CO2 emissions that China has. So I wrote down 10 billion tons for China. When we look at the 2019 emissions data, it appears that China, the US, and India are the three quote-unquote worst countries based on our carbon emissions. Is there anything else we should consider when stating this? So sure enough, these are the three largest emitters of carbon dioxide. But when we look at the populations, we're a smaller country by population compared to India, and we emit about twice as much as India emits. Now, we are smaller than China and we emit less than China, so it's a little harder to glimpse whether we're worse or better than China. But we're definitely quote-unquote worse than India if you look at our populations. So here I said larger population countries would be expected to have larger amounts of emissions. And because India has such a huge population and they're emitting less than the United States, probably because a lot of people don't own their own cars, would be my guess, or maybe their industry is less well developed, and that's a big emitter for the United States as well. When we complete the tons per person column, that's when we'll really be able to make a fair comparison of the various countries listed in this table. So the first row, we calculate for China, we take their carbon emissions divided by their population. And the reason we do it this way is because we're trying to find out how many metric tons per person they are responsible for. And this gives you a hint that you put tons on top and then you divide by the number of people on the bottom. So that's the order of division that we will do. And I wrote out the whole number, and I wrote out the whole number. And then if you see 6 zeros on top and bottom, you can actually just cancel out those 6 zeros and divide these numbers, which is what I showed next. And when we divide, it's about 7 metric tons per person in China. So you can go ahead and complete that process for the remainder of these rows. It looks like the US is actually worse than China by this metric, which is 16 metric tons per person. And we are not the worst on the entire list. Saudi Arabia, which is a big oil producing country, consumes more produces more carbon emissions per person than the United States does. However, they're a much smaller country. They're about 1/10 of the United States. So India, 2 metric tons per person, is similar to Indonesia. And I think we have an excerpt from Hans Rosling's books that addresses this point as well.